The personality of the Metropolitan of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Andrey Sheptytsky, in the history of independent Ukraine is now being revealed from new sides. This is thanks largely to declassified KGB archives. After all, Soviet propaganda articles and books called him a collaborator and an anti-semite. It is precisely because of this that in our time the Metropolitan, who saved the lives of hundreds of Jews, is not recognized by the title of righteous among the nations by Israel. What did Andrey Sheptytsky live by? Why was the KGB so afraid of him? His secular name is Roman Maria Alexander Sheptytsky. He was born in an ancient Polish-Ukrainian family, and the title opened up opportunities for the boy. He studied in Krakow, in one of the oldest educational institutions in Europe, the Jagiellonian University, then in Vienna and in Munich. He received his doctorate in law in 1888, and in the same year he received his status as a monk, taking the name Andrey. He loved Ukraine above all else. According to the Ukrainian historian Taras Hunchak, he put Ukraine on one level with his love for God. Documents relating to Count Metropolitan Sheptytsky consist of a huge array of testimonies. We can only wonder how many important things this man managed to get done in his lifetime. Through his monastic and priestly ministry, he demonstrated devotion to Ukraine and its flock. Sheptytsky lived in the village of Prilbichi. There was an estate in Galicia, and the ancestors of Sheptytsky are known to have held high office in the hierarchy of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and the Sheptytsky family were patrons according to the traditions of the local Greek Catholic parish. There is interesting correspondence between Andrey Sheptytsky and his father. He writes that we are Ukrainians from ages past, from the times of our forefathers. But when Sheptytsky came, he was reproached that he is a Pole, that he is a Catholic. This was done by the Galician intelligentsia in relation to Sheptytsky. They said, that's all we need, a Polish count as the head of our church. Well, that's how it was. But soon it became clear not only to skeptics but to everyone that the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was headed by a true Ukrainian patriot. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church reached its peak in the period when it was led by Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky. At this time, the policy that he introduced and the activities undertaken by the Church were aimed at developing Ukrainian society. The first Ukrainian Greek Catholic Theological Academy was opened in Lviv in 1928. It was the first university-type educational institution. A library and a museum were created on the foundation of the academy. Dozens of professors taught at this academy. There was also a publishing house. In addition to the academy, 5 theological seminaries were founded and operated. By 1939, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church had more than 6 million worshippers. They lived mainly in Galicia, in the western regions of Ukraine, and in Transcarpathia. According to academics, during the pastoral ministry of Andrey Sheptytsky, thanks to his sacrifice, the talents of the Church, and the leader of the people, the Greek Catholic Church reached the highest peaks for the entire previous period in its historical development. Thanks to the efforts of the bishop, patriotic youth organizations were founded, as were hospitals, and assistance was given to peasants and support to Ukrainian art and culture. The youth organizations Sokil, Plast, and others were created, which at various times consisted of well-known figures from the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, members of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and others. Children's literature was published. The Church fully supported education and medicine. Several cooperative unions were created that provided loans and supported the development of agriculture. Schools and hospitals were also built. Funds were raised for this purpose. When the Soviet authorities reigned over the lands of western Ukraine within the space of just a few days, the theological seminary, monasteries, and Catholic publishing houses were closed. After the Soviets arrived on the territory of western Ukraine on September 17, 1939, representatives of the special services began active work in due course against the Greek Catholic Church and other clergy. Interesting initial reports exist that were written by agents and collected by operational security officers in November 1939. There is evidence in the archives of the Security Service of Ukraine that Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky enjoys tremendous respect and authority in society. According to work done by researchers, such a figure was very dangerous for both Russian and German invaders. If he had wanted to, he could have roused the people for an uprising at any moment, or speaking in the language of documents, for counter-revolutionary actions. But this agent writes immediately that the Metropolitan is not planning anything of the sort. Just imagine how immensely important he was if this was reported to state security. It's clear the Church could not lead armed resistance against the occupying forces. Representatives of the sectoral archive of the Security Service of Ukraine are aware of the difficult relationship that existed between the Greek Catholic Church and the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, who advocated an armed resistance movement. The Church, as was its duty, condemned all forms of killing, in particular the political ones that the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists carried out in the interwar period when Galicia was under Polish rule. The documents testify that the closest person to Sheptytsky was Josip Kladochny. He did a great deal in his post as secretary of the Greek Catholic Church. In particular, Sheptytsky instructed him in 1939 to travel illegally to the Vatican with a package of documents. In these papers, Metropolitan Andrey provided information on the tough situation the Greek Catholics found themselves in. In 1941, he also instructed Kladochny to go to the territory of central Ukraine. The task was to report on the situation on territory occupied by the Nazis. These reports described the first days of occupation, the horror of the Holocaust, and the situation in which the multinational people of Ukraine found themselves in. At the same time, we know about the Sheptytsky secretary Josip Kladochny as a person recruited by the Soviet Special Services. He was later convicted of double dealing, and as an agent, still acting in the interests of the Ukrainian side. He was imprisoned in corrective labor camps. According to Ukrainian historians, only documented facts can give us an insight into the circumstances in which the Metropolitan found himself and how he acted. The Soviet authorities came in 1939 and launched repressions against the Church and the local intelligentsia. Of course, Sheptytsky welcomed the arrival of Germany. He thought that they are the heirs of Goethe and not barbarians who came from the West. That is why he wrote a letter of congratulations. "We're happy that you came, that you freed us from the aggression and persecution that we have been subjected since 1939. On July 1, 1941, Sheptytsky publishes a pastoral message in which he supports the declaration of Ukrainian statehood, proclaimed by the leader of the Ukrainian nationalists, Yaroslav Stetsko. However, the organizers of this action were thrown into the Nazi Sachsenhausen concentration camp. These events opened the Metropolitan's eyes to the true intentions of the invaders. There were some members of the clergy among those who proclaimed Ukrainian statehood in June 1941. They were also arrested and sentenced, like all organizers, by the Nazi government. When the creation of the ghettos began, when the destruction of the Jews began, when they began to take Ukrainians away into forced labor in Germany, the clergy also understood they were wrong in their beliefs, and the Nazi authorities did not bring the liberation they dreamt about. The Nazi authorities did not plan to create an independent Ukrainian state. They did not consider the Ukrainian people as independent people, but saw them as slaves, just like other people of captured European countries. It was after this that their enlightenment began. In the opinion of Sheptytsky, the prohibition of religious freedom and the imposition of atheism by the Soviet authorities were just small unpleasant problems compared with the murder and destruction of Jews by the Nazis. The clergy of the UGCC, headed by the Metropolitan, tried to save them in every way they could, risking their own lives in the process. Despite the fact that the hiding of Jews was punishable by death, the Metropolitan and his priests provided them with asylum in churches and monasteries. When the campaign to destroy the Jews began, Greek Catholics helped and saved them. Besides, this was done centrally. This process was headed by Metropolitan Andrey himself, who hid over 150 Jewish children and 15 rabbis in his metropolitan chambers. It was at his request that over 240 priests and monks provided the same help to Jews. The process was headed by the brother of Metropolitan, Andrey Sheptytsky. He was later awarded the title of righteous among the nations by Israel. However, Soviet propaganda always accused Andrey Sheptytsky of collaborating with the Nazis. The myths about Andrey Sheptytsky have no grounds at all, including the myth about his alleged cooperation with the Nazis. It's been documented that the Metropolitan was brave and a man of principle. During the occupation, he repeatedly made harsh allegations against Hitler's Nazi regime. There is a well-known story when in 1943, the leaders of the German administration asked Sheptytsky to support the creation of the Галичина division. His answer was decisive and categorical. There are hundreds of my priests in your prisons. You arrest them for helping ordinary people, including Jews. I do not have the right to make concessions, and this document really does exist. Ukrainian historians are convinced, in conditions where a person could be killed for the least resistance, it was a valid answer. In November 1942, Metropolitan Sheptytsky published a pastoral address in which he openly condemned any killing. And then he writes an open letter called "Thou shalt not kill," and he issues an appeal to the Reich Minister Heinrich Himmler with the demand not to allow the murder of Jews. He explained his demand by saying that these are inhuman acts and that they violate God's law. Thanks to the opening of the archives of the Soviet secret services, we can read the contents of the letters he addressed to Khrushchev as the then head of Soviet Ukraine. There are letters addressed personally to Stalin. The last one was written shortly before his death, about August-September 1944. The Metropolitan wrote to the head of the Soviet totalitarian state. At a time when Soviet citizens trembled in fear at the mere thought of Stalin, Metropolitan Sheptytsky reminded him of eternity and of repentance.
У випадку митрополита Шептицького є ще також важливо.
In the case of Metropolitan Sheptytsky, there is one circumstance we might take into account. Why did he, in spite of the radical position, both in the letter to Himmler and the same radical position towards the godless Soviet power, still remain alive? Because he was immensely respected. That's why they preferred not to touch him, but rather to pray for his death.
По-людськи кажучи, молитися на його смерть.
Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky belongs to a cohort of prominent religious figures of the 20th century. In July 2015, Pope Francis published a decree confirming the heroism of the actions of Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky. This document can serve as the start of beatification, the enrollment of the deceased to the congregation of the blessed ones, with subsequent canonization. In the fullness of the ecumenical Catholic Church, Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky is called a servant of God. This means that the process of consecrating the Metropolitan as a blessed person in the Catholic Church continues. The study of the life, actions and sermons of the man continues. After that, the Catholic Church will, through the lips of the Pope, consecrate him as a saint. Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky was the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church for over 50 years. He dedicated his entire life to serving the Ukrainian Church and the Ukrainian people. When the First World War began, the Austrian authorities offered him the chance to move to Vienna, but he stayed in Lviv and found himself in Russian camps, where he stayed until February 1917. When the Bolsheviks came in 1939, he did not leave Lviv. When they came again in 1944, he did not go either. Metropolitan Andrey always remained with his people, no matter how danger threatened his life.